Can everybody hear me? Okay, here we go. For 9 months, between May 1831 and February 1832, the young Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, who at the time was 26, and his companion Gustave de Beaumont, traveled across the United States by steamship, stagecoach, and horseback from Massachusetts to Wisconsin to New Orleans and many points in between. Both were descendants of aristocratic families that had suffered during the Revolution of 1789, but both had developed by the 1830s certain liberal political sensibilities that led them to travel to the United States to see what, as early as 1831, was still the oldest working democratic country in the world. By the end of the decade, Tocqueville had published his 2-volume study, Democracy in America, which has been in print ever since and has been called by one contemporary critic, one of our contemporaries, to general acclamation, quote, perhaps the greatest work ever written on one country by the citizen of another, end quote. In volume 2, first published in 1840, Tocqueville dealt at length with the effects of democracy upon the feelings and sensibilities of Americans. And in chapter 2 of the second book of volume 2, wrote the following with respect to what he called individualism in democratic countries. I'm quoting now. In ages of equality, every man seeks for his opinions within himself. And in American democracy, this has tended toward the genuinely novel idea of individualism. Our fathers were only acquainted with egoisme, in English, selfishness, which is a passionate and exaggerated love of self, which leads one to connect everything to oneself and to prefer himself to everything in the world. Individualism, however, is different. Individualism is a mature and calm feeling, which disposes each member of the community to sever himself from the mass of his fellows and to draw apart with his family and his friends, so that after he has thus formed a little circle of his own, he willingly leaves society at large to itself. Selfishness originates in blind instinct, but individualism first proceeds more from erroneous judgment than depraved feelings. Nevertheless, though selfishness blights the germ of all virtue, and individualism at first only saps the virtues of public life, in the long run, individualism attacks and destroys all other virtues as well, and is at length absorbed in downright selfishness. Thus, while selfishness is a vice as old as the world and belongs not to one form of society more than another, individualism is of democratic origin and tends to spread widely with the spread of democracy. Thus, in democratic societies, as conditions become more equal, citizens come to think they owe nothing to any man, nor expect anything of any man. They acquire the habit of standing alone, apt to imagine their whole destiny is in their own hands, end quote. Now, I don't know about you, but when long ago I first read that passage, it conjured up for me images of an American cultural sensibility that did not begin in earnest for more than 100 years after Tocqueville published these words. A cultural sensibility that appears self-evidently embodied, at least to me, in the physical form of post-World War II suburbs. And while we all know well the historical and technological events that eventually led to the post-1945 American suburb, for me, the Tocquevillian insight is that Americans in the early 19th century were already in some way predisposed to embrace suburban life because of our democratic habits of thought. Now, Tocqueville, otherwise an admirer of American democracy, thought that this inherent democratic tendency toward individualism might ultimately destroy American democracy. But he also thought Americans possessed certain counter habits that fought against individualism. Among these were the strength in early mid-19th century America of both families and religion, but these were not unique to American democracy. What Tocqueville thought unique was the American tendency to freely form associations. And of what he observed, he wrote this, quote, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. They have not only commercial and manufacturing companies in which all take part, but associations of 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, serious, futile, general or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found colleges, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. In this manner, they found hospitals, prisons, and schools. If it is proposed to inculcate some truth or to foster some feeling by the encouragement of a great example, they form a society. Wherever at the head of some great undertaking you see the government in France or a man of rank in England, in the United States, you will be sure to find an association. By now, some of you are surely asking, well, what's your point? And my point is this: regardless of how much the world and the United States have changed since 1830, apparently some things haven't. Thus, when there has arisen a perceived need to challenge for reasons environmental, economic, and spiritual the state of the built environment at the end of the 20th century, in Great Britain, this enterprise is spearheaded by the Prince's Foundation. But in the United States, it is spearheaded by classic Tocquevillian associations, such as Strong Towns, the Institute for Classical Art and Architecture, and of course, the Congress for the New Urbanism. So now finally to our speaker, Mallory Baches, the new president of the Congress for the New Urbanism, an alumna of the Notre Dame School of Architecture and one of our own. And I can't tell you how pleased I was to learn of her appointment earlier this year. Ms. Baches began her career as an urban designer upon her graduation in 1999, going to work immediately for Duane Plater Zybrick and Company in Miami, before eventually moving to the new urbanist community of Habersham in Beaufort, South Carolina. From her international work with DPZ, she became a founder of the first affiliate office, DPZ Pacific, overseeing new urbanist work across the Asia-Pacific region. She continues her own urban design practice with both private and public clients, providing award-winning greenfield and infill master plans, architectural and adaptive reuse, concept designs, design codes, and urban land use policy guidelines, and strategic planning direction for climate change impact. In addition, she brings with her extensive experience in the nonprofit sector, having served in both staff and advisory roles and on governing boards of numerous other Tocquevillian associations pursuing related public goods. She has many other credentials, too numerous to mention, but of her recent ascent to governing responsibilities at the CNU, it is no exaggeration to say that the torch has passed to a new generation of new urbanists. However, with that passing torch comes the special challenge facing the immediate successors of all revolutions, even revolutions on behalf of good traditions. The challenge of consolidating the revolution's gains and recoveries and extending them forward in the form of a durable culture that eventually becomes a good tradition. No tradition can be sustained that changes fundamentally with every change of leadership, but each generation's challenges are nevertheless their own. I'm very pleased with Mallory Baches' new role in the CNU. Please welcome her now to tell us about it.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? So, let's see. Okay, I think we'll be good. So, thank you, Dean Polizoides. Thank you, Professor Bass. Thank you, faculty, staff, and students for welcoming me today. You are getting a presentation that is brand new. I am a little bit brand new here in this role. So it's good to be in friendly confines, Bill. But you will excuse me if this seems a little bit rote. It is a new world that I'm walking into, speaking to universities across the country. I'm very excited to be doing it. I'm very thrilled to be doing it here at my alma mater. And all of that's to say that this is an honor and a privilege to be here, especially considering it feels like I was just on the other side of this podium, sitting in the seats listening to lecturers. And I will simply say it's funny how quickly 30 years can pass. I will also say that the tendency is all too real to feel the weight that one of the founders of CNU is here in the room. And with him, so many of the thinkers and teachers that have taught me so much of what I know. But that weight of a legacy that I've inherited is a reality that I've not only chosen to embrace, but to use as guidance for my leadership approach at the helm of CNU. I want to start by talking about my own Notre Dame story. That fellow in the hat is there with the two boys. That's my grandfather, Louis Ertl. Louis was the great-grandson of a German bricklayer who immigrated to the US and made a home in Franklin County, Indiana, just in time to fight with the Union in the Civil War. 3 generations later, Louis would end up with only an 8th grade education, thanks to the Great Depression. But he had a knack for building things. He learned brick masonry from his father and eventually operated what we would call today a design build firm. He had a fantastic eye for design, and with his business success, he was eventually able to travel across the country and even internationally to fulfill his curiosity for exploring new places. Louis was an unparalleled fan of Our Lady's University, and those 2 boys are my Uncle Mike and my father, Patrick, who grew up traveling to South Bend for every home football game. Mike would go on to get his master's in architecture at Harvard's GSD, and Patrick would study aerospace engineering here at Notre Dame. That's him in the graduation gown. My dad had 3 daughters, all of us seen here at the Old Morris Inn when I was a student, and we all graduated from Notre Dame, though I was the only one who kept to the family tradition of building. The photo on the right is from one of the last times I got to walk this campus with my dad and the oldest of his 3 granddaughters, my own daughter, Iris, who was in her senior year this year, her senior year of high school, and preparing our own college applications. Here I'm clearly making myself far too comfortable, literally on Palladio's Basilica in Vicenza, in this photo of my year in Rome. My time at Notre Dame was challenging and enlightening. It taught me to learn from the past in order to serve the future. And I share my Notre Dame story for 2 important reasons. The first is that I want to reinforce that, like every person in this room, I too am carrying the legacies of the generations who came before me and will come after. We feel a connection to this campus, in part because we're architects. If the curriculum hasn't changed too much, then you all still read Christian Norberg Schultz and you understand the concept of sense of place very well. But we also feel a connection to this place because I do believe that the land and the institution that stands here is uniquely special. The second reason that I share all of this is because I'm keenly aware of generations in my role that I now have as the president of the Congress for the New Urbanism. Let me explain a little more. Just 3 years before that previous photo was taken, this one was taken at the first of our movement's congresses in Alexandria, Virginia. It was a gathering intended to articulate goals for a new idea that these folks had coalesced around, coined, I understand, by Dean Polyzoides himself as the New Urbanism, and to build consensus around strategies for achieving these goals. This way of advancing discourse would become an annual event for the New Urbanism, and this past June, CNU hosted our 31st Congress in Charlotte, North Carolina. These original thought leaders of the New Urbanist movement were the first generation to think in a fundamentally different way about how our cities are built and rebuilt. And they united around a new way of understanding urbanism that after a generation, I am here to report, is still disappointingly new in far too many places. Around the exact time that I was sketching in Vicenza, thought leaders representing the many disciplines that contribute to the built environment, urban designers, architects, planners, developers, engineers, and more, we're finalizing a set of 27 principles describing their vision for walkable, sustainable, equitable alternative to suburban sprawl. The Charter of the New Urbanism was heavily debated and ultimately signed by the attendees at our 4th Congress in Charleston, South Carolina in 1996. And there are signatures right there as proof. Since then, it has been translated into 13 additional languages. I like to share the first line of the Charter's preamble to help folks envision what CNU is working to repair. The Congress for the New Urbanism views disinvestment in central cities, the spread of placeless sprawl, increasing separation by race and income, environmental deterioration, loss of agricultural lands and wilderness, and the erosion of society's built heritage as one interrelated community building challenge. I'll divert from the chronology only briefly here to say that I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the canons of sustainable architecture and urbanism. This companion document, finalized in 2009, clarifies what the Charter more broadly outlines for the relationship between new urbanism and sustainability. The canons were designed to serve as a set of operating principles for human settlement that reestablish the relationship between the art of building, the making of community, and the conservation of our natural world. Although I was still in school when the Charter was signed, you will find my name on the signatures of the canons. And that plan on the right is a project I directed shortly before being named president of CNU, the island-wide climate migration plan for the tiny island nation of the Republic of Nauru. My team and I leaned heavily on the canons and the Charter as a framework for our designs. Today, CNU's work is rooted in the same rejection of sprawl and embrace of an alternative that is walkable, sustainable, and equity supportive. We are a small nonprofit, but we like to say that we cast a long shadow, and our history of membership representing a rich diversity of practices and expertise helps us do so. So, the past, present, and future of CNU. When Stephanos and I discussed my lecture, he encouraged me to talk to you all about the vision I have for the future of CNU. But to do so, I feel that it's important that I ground that vision in the context it is built on, the destructive and pervasive land use patterns that our founders rejected with their alternative, the generation of new urbanism that the last 30 years has produced, and the impact that legacy has made. When the new urbanist movement began, no one was using the walkable neighborhood as a model for real estate development. Our founders recognized that every industry participating in the built environment at that time, finance, codes, design, policy, development, engineering, was biased towards automobile-based outcomes and single-use land patterns. They learned from the same sources that I'm sure you're still reading: Jane Jacobs, Christopher Alexander, Holly White, Kevin Lynch, and the many others who had begun to shine a light on the destructive and insidious nature of suburban sprawl. CNU's founding thinkers not only insisted there was a better way, but came together to write the Charter to serve as a blueprint for how to build that better way. Whoops. Oh dear. Hold on. It's being very touchy now. Anyway, we'll see if we can keep going. I just won't touch that machine. Over the past 30 years, we've made extraordinary advances. And also, as you look around any city or town, you can see there's still extraordinary work left to do. Rather than mixed use, mixed income, mixed transportation neighborhoods, what is far more prevalent in every corner of this country is what those who sell homes have successfully sold us as the American dream: a house with a yard and a white picket fence and at least one car per driving aged adult, neglecting to mention the endless, soulless, placeless stretches of arterials and parking lots and driveways in between them that the byproduct of only building this way for nearly 100 years has produced. And despite the ecological and social and economic harms that it causes, the industrial land consumption model continues to give us more of the same. This New York Times article from 2019 documented the extraordinary changes, I would say destruction, that portions of our country have continued to experience just in the past decade. This is what those examples look like on the ground. On the left, a development called Silver Lake in Katy, Texas, a suburb of Houston, and on the right, a retirement development called The Villages outside Orlando, Florida. You might note that they are almost impossible to distinguish by their land pattern, by their architectural form, by their relationship to the environment. Yet this is still the development norm in every one of the 50 states. Here at Notre Dame, I know you study the fact that the US has not always planned in such segregated, monotonous, unsustainable, unadaptable, conforming yet sprawling ways. In the 250 years between the establishment of these two settlements, the US has clearly changed its patterns. Lessons from that change are what sparked the New Urbanist movement and what drives CNU. Those lessons can also tell us about what the future holds for architecture and urbanism in this country. At its founding, CNU was a small gathering of absolute radicals, some of which right here in this room. And in the 30 years since that time, the organization has grown substantially in both size and in impact. By the numbers, the Congress for the New Urbanism has 2,500-ish active members and tens of thousands of practitioners who consider themselves new urbanists in principle and in their work. CNU has hosted 31 congresses, totaling 32,000 individual registrations. CNU 31 topped out with a total attendee number of 1,363. CNU has accredited thousands of professionals with CNUA certification. CNU has awarded 366 charter awards, a program honoring the best examples of new urbanist work that began in 2001. And I'll note, a program that many University of Notre Dame School of Architecture students and alumni have received honors from, including myself 3 times over. I simply pulled some of my favorite, this is absolute truth, I simply pulled some of my favorite charter award winning projects for this before noticing that for those keeping track, all but one of these has direct Notre Dame architecture ties, including folks here in this room. For bonus points, the one on the bottom left was not only designed by the firm of John Torty, whose name you would know, if not his work, by the Torty family Stoa just outside. But not only that, it was developed by the fellow sitting on Palladio's Basilica with me in the earlier photo. Absolutely true. Complete accident. CNU has coordinated 26 legacy projects in Congress host cities, pairing lead new urbanist experts with communities seeking pro bono technical assistance, specifically in those communities that have been systematically segregated, disinvested, and otherwise harmed by past planning. CNU has produced 8 Freeways Without Futures reports, which highlight local campaign organizers and activists seeking to revitalize their communities by literally dismantling their city's segregative urban highways. CNU has assisted 4 states with statewide zoning reform with its Project for Code Reform program, and developed 1 nationwide code reform handbook for average citizens looking for ways to advocate for healthier, more accessible communities. CNU has helped foster the creation of 13 affiliate organizations. Professor Best named some of those. I'll list them all so no one feels excluded. The Form-Based Code Institute, the National Charrette Institute, the National Town Builders Association, the Center for Applied Transect Studies, the Seaside Institute, the Urban Guild, the Incremental Development Alliance, the Place Initiative, Strong Towns, the CNU Congressional Black Caucus, the CNU Latino Caucus, the CNU Christian Caucus, and the Emerging New Urbanists. CNU has supported the establishment of 19 local chapters, including CNU Atlanta, California, Carolinas, Cascadia, Central Texas, Colorado, DC, Florida, Houston, Illinois, Michigan, Midwest, New England, New York, North Texas, Ontario, Savannah, Utah, and Wisconsin. In addition, there are student CNU chapters in universities across the country, including here at Notre Dame. CNU has partnered with AARP, America Walks, the City of Buffalo, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the State of Mississippi, the National Resource Defense Council, the Cerdna Foundation, the University of Miami School of Architecture, the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Green Building Council, and the West Side Future Fund in Atlanta. CNU has published the 25 Great Ideas of New Urbanism, which lists 25 key concepts that the new urbanist movement has brought from obscurity to mainstream. Included are now ubiquitous understandings of cities, like the 5-minute walk, the transect, the charrette, form-based codes, tactical urbanism, missing middle housing, coined and popularized by 2 more Notre Dame architecture alumni, which I'll mention again later in this, and many more. And of course, there are the built examples of new urbanism, the work of our members seeking to implement the principles of the charter that the charter lays out. Perhaps the most well-known is Seaside on the Gulf Coast of Florida, which I'm sure you've all studied. It's one of the earliest examples, designed in the early 1980s and constructed over subsequent decades. Seaside is an almost completely unique example of what US development can produce. Seaside proved that in only a single page, rather than sheafs of paper, you can simply and elegantly code for how a town should be built. Shown on the left is the code for Seaside in its entirety. Shown on the right is the complexity that that document regulates. Over the past 30 years, many more examples have followed, designed and developed based on those fundamental principles of the charter: walkability, diversity, environmental sustainability, and a mix of uses meeting daily needs. The top left is Newtown St. Charles, a project which I was lucky enough to get to draw the plan for. The top right is the neighborhood of Habersham in Beaufort, South Carolina. As Professor Best noted, I lived there for 15 years. On the bottom left is Uptown Circle in Normal, Illinois, a combined traffic management, public space, and green infrastructure planning project that was wildly before its time when it was designed in 2001. And on the bottom right is Harbortown, an early part of the now impressive revitalization of downtown Memphis, Tennessee. These are just a few of the hundreds and hundreds of examples of new urbanism built over the last 30 years. Still, it's important to remember that settlement based on the sort of principles found in the charter and based on successful historic patterns do not represent the vast majority of land development that happens in the US today. Remember my previous slides of Silver Lake in Texas and the villages in Florida. So, over the past 30 years, CNU has changed the national conversation on how to design and build our communities, from debating alternative forms of development to discussing how to best preserve, design, and restore our regions, cities, and neighborhoods. New urbanists have been responsible for identifying and popularizing many now common innovations in land use development pattern and strategy, yet there is still so much work left to do to halt sprawling development and reverse the devastating damage it continues to produce. More than 24 million acres of natural land have been lost to sprawl in the US over the last 2 decades, increasing the environmental, economic, and social consequences that severely diminish urban sustainability. Across the country, cities and towns are contending with these systemic, and some might say existential, challenges that sprawl only exacerbates. In response, the vision that CNU has for walkable, sustainable, equity-supportive urbanism demands innovative solutions and strategic outreach that improve the urban fabric by centering people in city building, now more than ever. There are signs of progress. The federal administration's multi-departmental decarbonization blueprint that came out in January calls out urban design as central to the federal goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The blueprint mobilizes not only the Department of Transportation in this, but the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency as well. Along with this mobilization, over the next 5 years, states will receive $350 billion in federal money for highways through the, for transportation, I should say, through the Inflation Reduction Act enacted last year. But federal policy doesn't necessarily translate into state action, let alone local impact. While some states have given early signs that they may use those federal dollars to change their approach to transportation spending, including following federal guidelines that encourage a fix-it-first approach before adding new highway miles, Unfortunately, many still are pursuing multi-billion-dollar widening projects. And those additional billions of vehicular miles traveled, or VMTs, that expanding highways will produce through induced demand will continue to contribute to rising greenhouse gas emissions, which directly result in further global warming. You can see why CNU's Freeways Without Futures advocacy work is so important. Meanwhile, the US currently faces a shortage of 7,300,000 affordable and available rental homes for low-income renters and needs more than 300,000 additional affordable homes for middle-income buyers. These housing shortages continue to climb up the income spectrum, only extending an already rapidly escalating wealth inequality across the country. Outdated exclusionary zoning is a crucial piece of the housing affordability puzzle. And critical tools demonstrating the intertwined costs of both housing and transportation must be better integrated into efforts to understand affordability comprehensively. Across the country, 75% of the land zoned for residential only allows single-family homes. Let me say that again. 75% of the land zoned for residential in this country only allows single-family homes, yet we're in a housing crisis. This leads to obviously less houses, but also limited types of houses and less supply and more demand of housing as a result. To repair this, we need to reform these local zoning codes. And there are 42,000 units of local government with zoning oversight in this country. CNU has tracked that somewhere around 1,000 communities have reformed their local zoning codes, 1,000 out of 42,000. You can see why CNU's Project for Code Reform regulatory work is so important. That same low-density land use that directly contributes to escalating housing unaffordability also leads to less inclusive communities. The way in which regions are planned and transportation is integrated has a direct impact on the opportunities that people are connected to. The way in which a neighborhood is designed to be compact and easy to walk has a direct impact on the access that people are able to enjoy. The way in which spaces and places are designed to include and accommodate people of all ages, abilities, and needs has a direct impact on the quality of life of a community as a whole. This isolation contributes to the increasing epidemic of social segregation and loneliness that is having devastating effects on individual health and well-being across the country. And the vision that CNU has for walkable, sustainable, equity-supportive urbanism now more than ever demands innovative solutions and strategic outreach that improve the urban fabric by centering people in that city building. You can see why CNU's Legacy Project Technical Assistance Program is so important. In response to these crises that cities are facing, CNU is at an inflection point ourselves. To explain inflection points, in the early 1990s, Andy Grove, then CEO of Intel, coined the term strategic inflection point to describe the importance of taking action at opportunistic times of change. At an inflection point, change is inevitable, for good or bad. Business as usual cannot continue. According to Grove, the lack of an effective strategy in response to those events is likely to lead to failure. After a generation and with so many compounding and correlating urban crises in front of us, the future of CNU must change. The question is, how must that change be strategically different in order for the organization and the movement to meet our mission? The answer to that lies in understanding that CNU serves as a key knowledge aggregator. We collect, prioritize, and disseminate the best practices in urban policy and design, and open doors for our members to enact meaningful change in their communities. Our members are the local actors implementing context-informed, community-based solutions to complex challenges. We recognize that these challenges require tailored solutions, and CNU provides guidance to our members on how to implement design practices to meet their local communities where they are at, addressing the unique needs they have in front of them. This collaboration with our members allows CNU to have a widespread impact on hundreds of communities across the nation without compromising on local community-driven change. Over the summer, we have been working to revise our strategic plan to better demonstrate where our focus will be over the next 3 years. These are the long-term outcomes we are working towards. Reforming detrimental regulations. Despite 30 years of advocacy for the principles of new urbanism, and despite the adoption of those principles by many allied groups and organizations with agency over the built environment, most regulatory regimes remain outdated, prioritizing the spread of placeless sprawl over the creation and recreation of coherent communities. The principles of new urbanism must permeate any policy reform impacting the built environment at every scale of governance. CNU already brings important proofs of concept to this effort. As an organization, we have developed a body of work in reforming local policy and regulation, whether that's through the Project for Code Reform, as I discussed, which provides tools and technical assistance to help local governments implement their zoning reform incrementally, or whether that's through our advocacy for transforming highways to boulevards. And like I mentioned, the biannual Freeways Without Futures report, the 8th of which just released this April. But there are new opportunities to partner with state and local governments to integrate our principles into policy. Over the next 30 years, CNU must do substantially more to build bridges between the need and the funding for expertise in legalizing walkable urbanism and those experts themselves, hopefully including some of you in this room. The next pillar is equalizing access to affordable urbanism. Roughly half of the American public sees affordable housing as a major problem in their communities, and an additional third reports that they are at the very least concerned about affordability. Across the country, the lack of affordable housing continues to expand up the income ladder, pushing legacy residents out of their own neighborhoods and forcing both prospective renters as well as homeowners further into sprawl to drive until they qualify. The environmentally, economically, and socially unsustainable implications stand in stark contrast to CNU's vision. CNU has a wealth of effort in making quality urbanism available to more people, but we also have significant work ahead of us. Our movement has a long history of advocating for diversity of people, places, uses, activities, and mobilities in our cities, towns, and neighborhoods. CNU members have authored the design principles for HUD's Hope 6 program. And the organization invests our time and talent and resources into our legacy projects, as I described. But to adequately meet the demand that our vision has for diverse, equitable, accessible, and inclusive neighborhoods, CNU must develop bolder initiatives that make a meaningful impact. We must do more to advance solutions to the drastically rising unaffordability, segregation, and displacement on display in most cities, particularly in the wake of urban reinvestment. It's an enormous task, but CNU must support every one of our members in centering equity within our collective city building work. And the third pillar is responding to a rapidly changing climate. Severe climate consequences, which were only predicted 30 years ago when our principles were first drafted, are now impacting a growing share of communities across the country and around the globe. As the planet warms, sea levels rise, and weather patterns drastically evolve, the demands of climate change are necessarily the opportunity landscape for the future of the work of the new urbanism. The changing climate threatens urbanism around the globe, and here again, new urbanism is not new to the conversation. Our charter directly addresses fundamental aspects of climate responsive design, and as I pointed out, the canons of sustainable architecture and urbanism elevate that discussion substantially and comprehensively. CNU members were key authors in the development of LEED neighborhood design standards and have developed fantastic tools for context-sensitive environmental management. But as we look at the depressingly slow pace that our communities are mitigating human impact on the changing climate, and when we consider the extensive ramifications that climate adaptation will create for urbanism across the country and beyond, it's clear that CNU must do more and more quickly with this constantly evolving crisis. Design of resilient urbanism in the face of the unpredictable impacts of climate change must be foundational to every project that new urbanists produce and every programmatic output that CNU initiates going forward. CNU recognizes that these urban challenges are intersectional. I'm hoping you all know this term, which comes from civil rights attorney and Columbia Law School professor Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of how race, class, and gender can create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Existing land use regulations routinely prohibit an urban environment that provides equitable outcomes for all members of the community while simultaneously reinforcing the disparate impacts of the changing global climate onto those same communities that have been disinvested for generations. Or in more simple terms, climate impacts are more likely to be severe in neighborhoods that bear an historic legacy of malinvestment, where land use regulations are least likely to support the vision that CNU advocates. Over the next 30 years, CNU is committed to bringing our work to the interrelated community building challenges posed by the rapidly changing climate, the lack of housing accessibility, and the outdated regulatory regimes that are foundational to both. Since coming into this role in January, my co-lead, Margaret Gaddis, and I have been, as they say, flying the plane while we are building it. The core function of CNU has always been our annual Congress, but as I just described, our strategy for the future will require our reach to be far vaster, and so we have initiatives brewing that we're very excited about. We are growing CNU's capacity to spearhead more and better research into the social, economic, and environmental benefits of the principles of new urbanism. We are launching a convening series focused on expanding our movement's understanding of inclusive urbanism and prioritizing ways our membership can improve the inclusiveness of their own designs. We're identifying publications that are needed to help educate more people on the best practices in design-informed policy. We're envisioning entirely new and deeply necessary programmatic initiatives, and we are focusing on the key role that local governments will play in the next evolution of city building. We recognize that if 30 years ago, the reinvention of urbanism was best demonstrated in the private sector, then over the next 30 years, the scaling of best practice will require the harnessing of the public sector. So with this explanation of where CNU is focusing our attention, our resources, and our platform, you may be asking yourselves how you fit in. To start, I would encourage you all to become student members of CNU. Current students can become members at no cost. You'll stay updated on the work that the organization and the members are doing. And I'd also encourage you to learn more about the Emerging New Urbanists, which is a coalition of young members of our organization who are focused on empowering up-and-coming leaders to shape the future of the Congress for the New Urbanism. They are folks like you who very recently were students. But beyond joining our community of practice, there are 4 ways that I want to activate you today. The first and most obvious, of course, is the fundamental skill you're building here at Notre Dame. Design is a constant practice of learning and relearning, and because urbanism is the context for almost any systemic barrier we face as a society, its design plays a crucial role in almost any solution. This image here is from the project I stepped away from directing, and I share it only to reinforce that I'm like you. While I'm looking at with a laser focus at the systemic urban challenges that we're facing, I'm still looking at them through the eyes of a designer. CNU must continue to expand our tent to include more disciplines aligned with our goals and create more equitable, more livable, more durable, and more beautiful communities as a result. But as we do so, we must likewise continue to demand that design excellence be required to make that vision real. You all are the future of that design excellence, and CNU is relying on the contribution of extraordinary urban design thinkers to empower the next 30 years of new urbanist impact. Where I use the word develop here on this slide, I don't necessarily mean that I'm urging you to become real estate developers, although if you are so inclined, I have a network of town builders and another of incremental developers that I can connect you with. But in this case, I'm talking about developing tools for understanding. Turning reasonable solutions into common practice is a method of collaboration that new urbanists excel and that propels our work. Like the concept of missing middle housing, which, if you aren't familiar, describes that category of housing typology that lands in intensity anywhere between detached single-family homes and mid-rise apartment buildings. In other words, duplexes, courtyard buildings, cottage courts, townhouses, live-works, and more. Coined and explained by fellow Notre Dame alumni, Karen and Dan Perolik, this is a kind of shared innovation that CNU relies on to help educate a broader audience. Without folks like Karen, Dan, and their firm sharing their understanding with our movement, our toolkit of solutions would be significantly weaker. Document. I say this not only as the president of a national organization seeking to effect change across the country. My organization benefits with the demonstration of that change, but also as the daughter of an attorney. Document, document, document. It is crucial that we analyze our work for what it achieves and what we can improve on. We can't master what we don't measure. Without a clear analysis and coherent understanding of the impact of our work on the communities we are engaging, we can't have confidence in our principles or our purpose. CNU needs practitioners that are committed to documenting the outcomes of their efforts to design better buildings, better blocks, better neighborhoods, better towns, cities, and regions. We need your partnership in holding ourselves collectively accountable for the outcomes we are all seeking. Lastly, and most importantly, we must commit to ensuring dignity for all into all our work as designers. Today, I've mentioned various projects that I've worked on over the years, and like children, you aren't supposed to have a favorite, but I do have a favorite. If I do, anyway, it's this work that I shared with one of my closest friends and with an extraordinary community in East Chattanooga, Tennessee. For 10 years, this small creative placemaking collective sat at the table alongside neighbors, supporting them as they envisioned a future for their community that redressed the past harms their neighborhood had experienced from both structural and implicit disinvestment. I'm deeply moved by beautiful designs, but I'm motivated by the impact that design can have on people's quality of life, on their ability to connect with each other and feel connected to an equally shared experience of well-being. That is what the best urban design can produce, a built environment that offers the dignity of collective worth and respect. By now, I've hopefully given you both an idea of what the next 30 years of new urbanism might look like, and how I hope that each of you will contribute to that vision. But I'd like to return to my original thesis about generations. It's so easy to lose sight of the fact that the work of city building simply takes an extraordinary amount of time. New urbanism is a way of thinking about urbanism, and urbanism is not an end condition. We're here at the end of the lecture, so I won't delve into the theory of Henri Lefebvre or Neil Brenner, but if you want to talk about that, please come see me afterwards. I will encourage everyone to remember that successful urbanism is not just a three-dimensional proposition. Yes, the actual design of our communities matters, but we can't forget the crucial role that fourth dimension of time, and beyond that, the fifth dimension of people play in establishing the authenticity as well as the utility of the urban realm. I live in Savannah, Georgia, a city nearing 300 years. As I walk the streets of my city, I'm reminded that the places we tend to hold dearest are those that have withstood the lessons of the past, evolving in order to guarantee their future. Savannah is widely celebrated as one of those cities, but I would argue that just like every person carries the legacies of those who came before them and will come after, cities do the same. They evolve, and with support, they can hopefully improve generation after generation. As a final note of what the next 30 years might look like for architecture and urbanism, there is one enormous step that we are taking at CNU. Launching on October 2nd, CNU will be soliciting proposals for amendments to the Charter of the New Urbanism. This year-long process will elevate those aspects of our shared practice that the majority of members might consider fundamental to our vision for cities, though not explicit in the charter itself, and therefore ought to be spelled out as an amendment. The weight of what this change will mean to the legacy we inherit and the future we precede is daunting, but exciting. The charter is something that I have always held as a gold standard in my practice. A generation after it was drafted, debated, and adopted, it is reasonable to think that there may be ways it can be improved. And as someone who grew up in this movement, I feel an extraordinary sense of responsibility for the thought and commitment and determination of the folks that have carried its principles in their practice for more than 30 years. Looking ahead, I'm encouraged by the opportunity for a new generation of new urbanists to contribute their wisdom toward the future work of our movement. My hope today was to encourage you to see your role in improving the future through architecture and urbanism, and ultimately, seeing yourself in the future of CNU. You are the generation that will activate our movement in the next 30 years of convening, educating, and collaborating to create a more walkable, sustainable, equity-supportive urbanism, an alternative to suburban sprawl. This photo isn't my class sketching on the steps of Bond Hall while CNU was being founded 30 years ago, but it could have been. So when I'm the age that Dean Polyzoides is now, and you are all my age, what will the urban challenges be? What will you have learned and relearned in the 30 years that will pass all too quickly? How will the discoveries you make through the practice of design have helped combat the urgent challenges that cities are currently facing today? Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have. Yes.
Mallory, thank you for that, for the wonderful pressure for some of us to make an introduction for others. One of the things that I've noticed, even kind of on the fringe of the movement, so to speak, looking in, is that there's for a long time been a kind of a debate within the CNU about greenfield development versus existing building stock. And one of the things that I've observed as an achievement of the CNU, or at least let's say the techniques developed by the members, applied in the field of historic preservation. There are places that do not have sufficient legislation to protect historic resources, but something like a form-based code comes along, and example, West Palm Beach, Florida, for example, it was the New Urbanist plan that created a historic preservation movement in West Palm Beach. So the sort of natural question that arises in my mind is, maybe could you talk a little bit about the convergence of these two movements, of new urbanism and historic preservation, and how they can work together to achieve all of the values and climate-related issues.
Sure, absolutely. That's great. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the question is, I'm going to summarize it terribly, very simply. The question is about the sort of initial legacy of new urbanism and having a real impact on how greenfield development is established, is implemented, and aligning that with some of the early impact that CNU has had on the downtowns, particularly communities that do not have resources to protect to designate historic preservation, and being able to utilize new urbanist tools like a form-based code in order to be a protectionary measure instead. It's a great question. One thing that I like to bring up when we talk about the success of greenfield projects, and sometimes you've stated it as a a positive and a positive. Often I will get the question of a positive and a negative. The CNU has done a lot in Greenfield. Why has CNU done less in the urban context, in the existing urban context? So there's sometimes work I have to do to correct that and remind folks of good examples like West Palm Beach. But I also like to bring up the fact that when this movement began, and I'll sort of relate this to my time living in Haversham, when this movement began, it was illegal to do any of this. And the one very useful mechanism that existed oftentimes was in a large parcel of land, in a greenfield context, meaning, open land, undeveloped land, often with limited, if any, neighbors, that these projects could apply for a planned unit development zoning approval, which is a PUD. And that was a tool that would allow what happened inside the boundary of that project to be implemented according to its own set of rules. It would still have to go through an entitlement process with whoever the designating municipality was. But for example, Habersham, which is outside of Beaufort, South Carolina, it was quite rural, had a road on one side, a property, one property owner on one side, another property owner on the other side. That was 2 negotiations of, consent, and that's it. And that project, Haversham, outside Beaufort, was the charrette, I believe, was in 96, began construction 99, 2000. It is still under construction to this day, it's not finished. But at the time, it was able to go through this entitlement process fairly simply because all of the rules for the project were designated as part of the project itself. They weren't intended to apply anywhere else, just within the project. So that meant if you needed to implement streets that were much skinnier than the existing standards, which we would have, so that they could be traffic calm, so that they could have a more enjoyable, more appropriate public realm, building face to building face, that you could just write those standards and include them as part of your PUD, and those were the rules for that particular property. If you wanted to have different building types, not single family and not commercial, but say combining a residence with a commercial space and a live-work unit, you could do that. You could just write the rules for what that would look like. And I'm sort of saying you could write the rules like nobody put any oversight into this. That's not exactly correct, but it was a freedom to be able to produce example of what the ideas embedded in the principles of the charter were. But it was really only relevant in that sort of context, a greenfield context, usually outside of town, usually not adjacent to a lot of property owners. And it reinforces that, understanding that history reinforces that at that period of time, these were example projects. These were attempting to prove the principles not in historic example that could be measured, like Alexandria, Virginia, or Pasadena, California, but in new build, in new development context, and show that it could be done. The other aspect of that I think West Palm Beach is a good example of, you mentioning the form-based code there sort of working as a historic preservation tool. When you're looking at existing urban frameworks and the tools, the policy tools specifically that help reinforce better urbanism in those spaces, those are not exactly your sort of sexy, flashy, rendered example of what new urbanism looks like. And it also, those are policies that it takes time to show the evidence of, to see the evidence of. And so they aren't something that once it gets enacted, you have immediate proof, or even short-term proof maybe, it lends itself to operating as a policy over time and sort of demonstrating its success by the way that that policy controls or doesn't control outcomes. So I think that when we look at one generation, a 30-year generation of this movement, that's a bit of an example as to why that dichotomy seems to exist. And also, for me, it shines a light on the fact that we aren't returning to cities from scratch as a movement. We've been working in cities this whole time. The USA Today may think that we're only building seasides, but we have been working with federal agencies. We have been working on policy directives. We have been helping to restore our built heritage in cities and towns all around the country. And I'll give you one final piece of this, which is, knowing Beaufort well as I do, that PUD did give an example of how it did demonstrate how urban design could be implemented quite differently from what the existing regulations on the books would have provided. Beaufort eventually would do a civic master plan for the whole city. They would enact a form-based code for the city. The county would pick that up and enact also a form-based code alongside. Multiple other municipalities in the county, distinct municipalities, would enact form-based codes. And there are a sampling of sort of hybrid greenfield new urbanist projects, a little bit new urbanist, a little bit not, varying on that scale of how many principles they're really embedded with throughout Beaufort County. And all of that's to say that the demonstration worked locally. The demonstration proved that there was an alternative to sprawl. And the development community recognized that in the local area. The municipal planning agencies recognize that in the local area. The politics, the decision makers, the elected officials, they recognize that in the local area. So it actually did the job over time. And I think that's sort of a really interesting example that shows you that it isn't just an excuse to say, oh, well, it was the only way you could do it back then, but to show that the rationale behind it did have the lasting impact that the folks doing that work at the time, as I look at some of them right now, were intending. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So there's a really large tendency from national home builders to copy and paste that suburban sprawl. Maybe it's because of the demand, or there isn't really any action through zoning. How do you see them playing a role in the solution, if at all? Or does that really come down to the municipal zone?
It's a good question. And the question, I'll repeat it, is what role national home builders have in this problem space, and whether they can be part of the solution, whether the solution primarily lies in the hands of the municipal governments reforming their regulations to control those home builders, or whether the home builders can have some sense of agency. One of the partners that isn't listed on that list, it occurs to me, is the NAHB, the National Home Builders Association. I will struggle on the date, early aughts, CNU firms partnered with Beazer Homes, a national home builder, and built the NAHB conference was being held in Atlanta, and on Castleberry Hill, a neighborhood near downtown Atlanta, Beazer Homes built 3 example live-work units. Because it must have been probably 2001. In that era, it was not common for a new live-work unit to be built at all. In fact, Habersham, which I talked about, having live-work units, they didn't begin building their live-works until probably about 2004, 2005. So this was before that. And the the rationale was that all of these home builders were coming to this annual conference and wanted to see what the new innovations were. And the new innovations at that time were that you could, crazy enough, put commercial and residential together in a single package. And, they'd never, looked at an historic city, I guess, I don't know. So all that's to say that that is a very late, far back in history example that the home builders can be good partners for better urbanism. There are a lot of other mechanisms at play. There are the regulations. A national home builder is probably the one of the less likely groups to choose to, fight the local council on what can get approved. It's just really not a part of their business model. But there are a lot of other mechanisms informing why the predominance of, we would, in design terms, we might call it a snout house, right? Like a house that the garage is the piece that sits all the way forward. So it looks like the snout of some animal instead of a home facing the street with dignity, So the answer to your question is, yes, they can, and ultimately at scale, need to be a part of the solution. But encouraging that requires that certain dominoes fall. One of those dominoes actually has fallen. When I was first starting my career, the National Association of Realtors used to say that 30% of the public wanted walkable urbanism, and the other 60-70% didn't. That thing is flipped. Now the preferences are in the opposite direction. That makes a difference, but the important distinction there is what is, walkable, sustainable, equity supportive urbanism. What does it look like? Because we can probably find our way around South Bend, let alone anywhere else, and find what might seem like new urbanist housing in a very not urbanist context, in a layout that is surrounded by, parking lots. A townhouse with parking lots is my biggest, I want to bang my head against a wall to see just strips and strips of townhouses, but they're just surrounded by parking lots, and you think, oh, you were so close and then missed. So I think that preference we're starting to see the evidence of, but the land planning part of it, and why I think that urban design is such a crucial knowledge to have, is because the technique in putting these puzzle pieces together in a way that is efficient, in a way that takes into account transportation demands, takes into account drainage, takes into account public space, takes into account proximity and walkability and accessibility, takes into account the variety of market demands that inform the different types of houses that might need to be built and how and why. That ability to synthesize all of that information into a master plan is something that is very rare. And the more Notre Dame students and whatever other universities want to join in that are teaching that education, the more likely we can be to impact the regulatory communities, impact the home builders associations, impact the capital mechanisms that choose what to finance and what not, and how to do so. And when all of those systems are beginning to line up, we'll be getting a lot closer to meeting that preference flip that I described, where folks are actually getting the walkable urbanism that 70% of the country says they want. Yes, Lucian.
Yeah, I want to follow up on your last point and ask you, do you have any kind of statistics or knowledge about involvement of architects? The architect is a profession, because we kind of architect, and often architects are told that's just the business, the urban design is, it's politics, it's development, and it's a home business or whatever.
Yeah.
But what is really, and also when you show examples, developments have been designed by architects that we kind of really put a very authoritative stand on urbanism, but it's not, I just think that it's still, the architects are not driving, they should, but they're not driving the reforms of how cities should be built, and they still don't consider that architecture and urbanism cannot be dissociated. They have to work hand in hand. And so, another thing is, what other schools are kind of sensitive to that, and are you doing academic outreach? You do like massive academic fertilization or
Those are great. Okay, so I'll do the first one, explain the question, and then answer it, and then I'll jump to the second one. The first question was sort of building off what we were just talking about and asking what role architects are playing if I have, sort of data, or if I have explanation of the role that architects today are playing or maybe not playing in informing the urban design of place, working beyond just the building envelope, and noting the fact that this, the founders of our organization were architects, are architects, including so many of the folks who continue to participate in new urbanism. There's a large proportion of architects. The best data point I can give you just off the top of my head is we continue to have, when we do our surveys from the Congress, the largest representation, the largest professional representation that we get attendance in the Congress is architects, self-identified architects. So yes, we still have a large body of influence, let's say. But I think that the question sort of strikes at something that then will lead to your second question. It strikes to the fact that architecture, I'm a little biased, having been educated by you, Lucien, and in this room, not this physical room, but in this university, that the unique integration of the urban into the consideration of the design of buildings is not something that is consistent throughout architecture schools across the country. And the participation of architects into the new urbanist movement, I would argue, is sort of self-selective. There are the architects who see themselves in the design of place, but are thinking about design of place beyond the building site and really thinking much more broadly. And this is not an intent to slander architects who maybe don't see themselves as new urbanists, who have sort of stylistic differences from what common new urbanist work might look like in built form. I'm navigating my way around strictly modernist as opposed to traditionalist. But I do think that an interest in integrating all of those different disciplines into architecture is a unique interest that new urbanist architecture members, new urbanists who are architects and really, self-ascribe to our movement, that they are unique in that vantage point. Which leads to your next question of, is CNU doing, sort of outreach, fostering better relationships with the academy more broadly than the universities? We do have relationships with it, obviously. University of Notre Dame is a key relationship. The University of Miami is another key relationship. We have, from time to time, had particular faculty at other universities that may have, had a strong influence on CNU. Ellen Dunham Jones is at Georgia Tech and is a board chair and a fellow. And Emily Talon is now at the University of Chicago and doing research there. And so, her focus is less on design and more on the analytical, but all to say that we do have relationships into various universities across the country by way of our membership. But to answer your question, we are just beginning that broader outreach that I believe we need. And That's a part of my tenure at the organization, recognizing not only that CNU is not making the inroads into a lot of university programs and into classrooms where the faculty would be interested, even if the interest is simply in critiquing new urbanism, that's useful to us. It's analysis of what we are getting right and wrong and understanding our work and different perceptions of our work. But furthermore, there is broad understanding of the benefits of walkable, sustainable, equity supportive urbanism. That infiltrates architecture schools, it infiltrates business schools, it infiltrates real estate programs, transportation engineering, civil engineering. You know, we have an opportunity, if we are talking to students in all of these different disciplines, not only to reach them and try to make urbanism, understandings of urbanism more central to their work, but furthermore to reinvigorate our movement with the young professionals coming out of school that are going to, for a longer period of time, have an influence on the built environment. The more that we can be bringing new generations into CNU and into our movement, the better we're going to be able to say 30 years from now, yeah, we did conquer some of those challenges. We did play a significant role in responding to climate change, in addressing housing and accessibility, in legalizing better urbanism. And so we're at the beginning. This is stop one. Yes, Steph.
I would like to finish
Yes.
this wonderful evening by acknowledging how difficult it is to be the executive director of the President of CNU. For many, many, many reasons. One of them is because we have heard about 20, 25 cats on board every once in a while, and 1,500 members that we see every Congress. It's a very difficult job because the urbanists are notoriously independent-minded and competitive, and otherwise often out of control. So it's very heartening that you're the first person in 20 years probably in this position to be offering a vision, and an ambitious one that seems to be well beyond the capacity of organizations to develop it, but it is the only way to be, and the only way institutions possibly, they ought to be shooting as far and deep as they can in the hope that something doesn't happen. I think everybody in this room is enormously proud of you and very critical for your presence here today, for your new role. And everyone here pledges, I'm sure, their willingness to support you informally. I would like to add that as dean of the school, I can pledge to support you formally in a couple of very important ways. I think the first one is that two things that I've always wanted to accomplish in some way as a member of this organization was to have a great publication that documents 30 years of what has been done, which is beyond extraordinary when you look at the items that were invented by this organization. And the second one is to have a research organization at the same time, or parallel to it, that in fact is involved in extending the field of knowledge that we need to get into in refining and developing ideas further. So as dean, I can tell you that we have launched content as a publication. That publication is open to you for special issues, for introduced by members, for broader circulation within the membership. I think that would be a wonderful thing to see this work as being very much in the light of what the city is trying to accomplish. Not the only thing, but it could be one of the things. And the other one, which is more important, so we're trying to launch a research organization within the school that has to do with adaptive buildings in cities. And I think we can begin and should begin by some very intimate small conference that lays out the scope of work about what could be done in this respect. Again, the CNU is not the only issue within this potential center or initiative. It could be one of the important ones. So to the extent we can help you realize some of these dreams, it's in this important direction. I think we are there to do that. And thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.